everybody. We got a great one today, for a change. Dana Milbank, opinion columnist for the Washington Post, joins me to talk about the new Speaker of the MAGA House, Mike Johnson. Who would have thought, that Kevin McCarthy wasn't so bad? I mean, ideologically. He is a Republican and would be anything he felt his caucus wanted him to be. But this guy, Mike Johnson, if that really is his name, Mike Johnson is his name. Learn how to pronounce it. Mike Johnson from Louisiana. Evidently, not a terrible human being in the sense that he's not Jim Jordan and gets along with colleagues, but a far-right religious ideologue who believes in terrible, hateful things. For example, that same-gender sexual activity is a sin against God, which fits his caucus. It's a scary time. It appears that, like his caucus, he still believes, or more likely pretends to believe, that Trump won the 2020 election. And I am beginning to believe that Trump could actually win this election. I know. And I mean, even if he's convicted, even if he's in prison, which is unlikely, but I don't know why he doesn't get convicted in the January 6th trial. I don't know how the appeals process works in that timeline in terms of the November election. I should know, and usually this podcast is entirely fact-based, but I don't. I'm kind of just riffing here. But I could easily see Trump getting convicted in the January 6th trial and in Georgia. This past week, we had Jenna Ellis and Sidney Powell and the Cheesebro guy cop pleas in the Georgia case. And that's in state court, which he can't pardon himself for, even if he does get elected. I mean, can the president serve as president from a state prison? That doesn't seem likely, but we are a nation of laws. There would be a lot of pressure on Congress, even a Democratic Congress, to write some legislation, I suppose, that would spring him so he could work out of 1600. But would Democrats even do that? I imagine Trump might take it to the Supreme Court, but they refused to take the Texas case. Remember, right after Biden won the 2020 election, the Texas Attorney General tried to get the Supreme Court to decertify the results in Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. But the 6-3 conservative Supreme Court, 3 of whom Trump picked, rejected that case. Doh. And guess who wrote the amicus brief for that case, a friend of the court brief for that case, that over 100 of his House Republicans signed on to? Mike Johnson. Yep. And this guy still refuses to acknowledge that Joe Biden won the 2020 election and believes that same-sex sexual relations are a sin against God. And will he pass a continuing resolution by November 17th to keep the government running? Well, give a listen and see what Dana Milbank thinks. It's a great one today. For a change. Dana, thank you for joining us. Dana Milbank is with us.
It's always a pleasure.
You're an opinion columnist for the Washington Post, so I'm going to be asking your opinion.
That's what I offer.
Okay. How long has this process been going on to pick a new speaker?
God, it feels like years, but it was actually 22 days from the moment they booted McCarthy till they voted in this guy whose name nobody can remember.
It's Mike Johnson.
That's it.
There. Well, I helped you out there.
Appreciate it.
Now, you obviously follow the House very closely. did you know Mike Johnson? Did you have to Google him, or did you know?
Well, I did because I've been very avidly following the weaponization committee, where he's been, sort of out there with the deep state stuff and screaming and yelling at the Democrats. And he was also pretty prominent during the Trump's first impeachment as a defender on the Judiciary Committee. So, for the connoisseur, he was not an unknown quantity.
What did he do for that first impeachment? Wasn't he counsel to it in some way?
Well, yeah, I mean, he was a member of the Judiciary Committee, and he did a lot of screaming and yelling in defense of Trump. He was overshadowed, to be fair, by Jim Jordan and some others. But that was sort of his debut to an extent. But I mean, he remains, as you mentioned, almost entirely unknown. We had Susan Collins, who's the top Republican on appropriations, said she had to Google him. We had Paul Gosar, congratulating Jim Johnson, and
okay,
and we had Kay Granger, the head of appropriations in the House, stands up and votes for Mike Rogers, and I said, "Wait, I mean Mike Johnson." So. Even his colleagues are a bit confused about all of this.
Well, that name, Mike Johnson. There's a lot of Mike Johnsons in Minnesota.
Right. In a sense, we all know a Mike Johnson.
We all do. And let's get to know this Mike Johnson. But first, can you talk us through these 22 days from the ousting of McCarthy to all these different nominees, Scalise and the Jordan saga and Emmer? And can you give us a little the history of?
Yeah, I mean, I've been hanging out at a combination of the Capitol basement, where I'm sure you've wandered, and then the Longworth building, the Ways and Means Committee room. And what we've been waiting for was the ouster of Kevin McCarthy by 8 people. Steve Scalise, the majority leader, wins the election in the caucus fair and square. But then the supporters of Jim Jordan, basically legislative terrorists, refused to support him, forcing him to go down. I think it was 19 hours later. Then Jim Jordan gets his shot, and finally, there's like 5 or 6 moderates in the House, and House Republicans, and a few institutionalists, and for once they got a backbone. And
now, did people receive threats? Not from Jordan himself, but from other anonymous folks?
We several members reported receiving death threats. Some needed security for their kids. Don Bacon, a moderate from Nebraska, his wife received threats. It was really, truly ugly. Now, it wasn't anything that Democrats and committee witnesses who had been the target of Jim Jordan in the past hadn't received. That was fairly common, but this time, well, they were, the threats were directed at Republicans, and they were incensed about it. And Jim Jordan said, "Hey, I'm not doing it," which was true. He was not actually the one calling in the threats, but neither did he seem to be making any real effort to stop it from happening. And that's, John Boehner has called him a legislative terrorist, and that's how he functions, with bullying and with threats.
He went up for 3 votes, right? And each time less.
Yeah, he actually went to the House floor. That was part of the bullying effort. He knew he didn't have the votes, but he wanted to concentrate the rage of Trump and Steve Bannon and Sean Hannity and everybody else on these 20, eventually 25 holdouts. But it didn't work. And I have to say, I was surprised by that. The squishes in the Republican Party always seemed to give in to the hardliners. That was one time when they didn't. So, yeah, 3 failed votes on the floor. And finally, it took a week or so. But then Jordan was out. Then we went through the whole Hollywood squares of 9 candidates. Tom Emmer, who's sort of been a non-entity. He was Kevin McCarthy's, as whip. He was the top vote counter for Kevin McCarthy. We know how well that went. And he set the land speed record. It was 4 hours and 7 minutes he was the nominee for before.
I thought it was going to be Emmer. I mean, I'm from Minnesota, and Emmer's not a bad guy. But what did him in is that he said that Biden won the election.
Yes, which is, obviously a cardinal sin.
And also voted for same-sex marriage, right?
Yeah, and both were just really unforgivable
Yeah.
in this caucus, and he was savaged, immediately. It was sort of the same treatment that Scalise got, but it was the added component of Trump jumping in and calling him a rhino,
Rhino globalist, I
a rhino
believe.
globalist, as opposed to the parochial rhinos.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, he was complete. So he was doomed from the start, and I mean, it was just that was just mayhem. That was Tuesday. I've lost track of the days of this week, but then they turned around, basically 6 hours later, and I think it was just basically a sense of exhaustion in the caucus, I think the moderates like, fine, Mike Johnson will do. He may have the same views as Jim Jordan, but he's not. At least he's polite and affable. The conservatives got the guy they wanted, and then
But this
so
is an
finally,
extreme right-wing conservative.
yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, but in the House Republican caucus, I think the far right now and has had effective control over that. So he's not particularly, he's certainly not an outlier in the House Republican caucus, but is much more in line with the Matt Gaetzes of the world, the holdouts who had been bedeviling Kevin McCarthy from the first day. So really the question is now, is he actually going to govern that way? And sort of dare force the moderates, the establishment Republicans, such as they are, the institutionalists, to go along with that plan and essentially bully them into going along with this agenda. Or there's also the possibility that because he's a true believer, he'll have more credibility when he says to the hardliners, "Look, we can't do this. We've got to compromise." So I'm hopeful for the second, but the past does not give us a lot of reason for hope.
Well, what you're saying there is that the hard right majority will cut him some slack, saying, we know you're really where they wouldn't give that to McCarthy.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the optimistic outlook here. And you're hearing some of them say, okay, we can go with a continuing resolution, to keep the government funded, whether it's through January or through April. And they really weren't letting McCarthy get away with that. And they're saying, well, okay, the government's going to shut down in 3 weeks. We got to give this guy a chance. But then you're also hearing Chip Roy from Texas and others saying, okay, we can have a continuing resolutions, but it's got to be like, something like, slashing the entire government by 30%. So, I mean, if that's the standard there, then we are going to have a government shutdown after November 17th.
Right. And those right-wing Republicans realize we do have a Senate and a president and how the government works.
Well, I mean, they may realize that in an intellectual level, but you got to remember that the people electing Chip Roy are the tiny sliver, 12% of the electorate voting in a Republican primary. He was saying during the 22 days without a speaker, he said his voters are actually liking what they see. They like to see them put up the fight. So I think it was 70% of the country was saying this is an unacceptable way to do business, but Chip Roy represents that 30% that's like, sure, just shut down the entire government. We don't like what they do anyway.
Well, let me ask you about that in terms of gerrymandering and how we elect our representatives. This is something that hasn't gotten enough attention, which is the Supreme Court ruled a few years ago that they can't rule on partisan gerrymandering. They can do it on racial gerrymandering, right? Like they did
right.
But we have these state legislatures gerrymandering all these districts where they create a district where a Republican is going to win that race. It's 60% or more Republican. And so the winner of the Republican primary is going to be the nominee. So that means to get the nomination and to be the representative from that district, it's just the most hard right candidate wins, right?
That's exactly right. And there have been studies showing that you take the 8 most extreme members of the House, the ones who essentially the ones who booted McCarthy, and there was something like they were elected by combined the 8 of them by, I don't remember the exact number, but in the tens of thousands of people in a country of 330 million. And it is true there's a bit of the sort of the both sides. Everybody does the gerrymandering if you can get away with it now that the Supreme Court has blessed it. But right now we have going on in North Carolina, certainly the most extreme gerrymandering I've ever heard of. It's basically a 50-50 state, Democrats and Republicans, 7 Republican representatives in Congress, 7 Democrats. So the Republicans in the state legislature, with the blessing of the state Supreme Court and freed by the United States Supreme Court, have just redrawn the map so that there will be 10 Republican seats instead of 7, and 3 Democratic seats instead of 7, and one is sort of in play. So that's not a democracy. So basically, that's saying no matter what happens in the election, you are going to have 10 Republicans representing this state in Congress. It doesn't matter if the voters want to kick the bums out; they can't kick the bums out because the seats aren't even remotely competitive.
And that is the Roberts Court that I think knew what it was doing.
Well, of course they knew what they were doing. Now, there's going to be a challenge to this, saying that you've also diluted the vote of black voters, which seems fairly clear. But will the courts even uphold racial gerrymandering? Now, who knows? We talk about rigged elections. I mean, that's the definition of a rigged election. It doesn't matter how voters vote. You know what the outcome's going to be in advance.
Well, let's talk about who Mike Johnson is, since everybody kind of had to Google him, and I didn't know anything about him. He is an extreme right-wing religious zealot. Would that be fair to say?
That would be it would be fair in my view. I mean, yes, certainly he's an evangelical Christian, which that doesn't make him the zealot.
Well, Jimmy Carter is an evangelical Christian.
Right. So what I think makes him the zealot is what he said about homosexuality, not just voting against gay rights and gay marriage, but supporting anti-sodomy laws at the state level.
He believes that Lawrence is wrong. That, in other words, that I believe that he believes that same-sex sex is a sin,
right,
and it's unnatural.
He says homosexuality is inherently unnatural,
and would make it a crime. So that's
right,
and that's his decision. Or
he is opposed to the Supreme Court's decriminalization of gay sex. He said, by closing these bedroom doors, they have opened a Pandora's box. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Speaker of the House.
He's as extreme in these beliefs as Jim Jordan is. I'm not sure what Jim Jordan feels like a pugilist or I guess a wrestler, a grappler. And this guy, Mike Johnson, people like him.
He's polite. He's affable. Now, look, during these weaponization hearings, they're led by Jim Jordan, but Mike Johnson's been, shouting and heckling and interrupting. So I think the whole polite and affable thing can be overdone. But in general, he doesn't sound like a bomb thrower. So I think that's the difference. The views are there. He blamed, after Katrina down in Louisiana, he blamed the looting on secularism, liberalism, and legalized gambling. Okay. These sorts of views obviously are, the Democrats are going to do whatever they can to make people aware of this. You saw a little bit of it in Hakeem Jeffries' speech inside the House chamber, and a lot more of it in what they're saying in their statements outside of the House chamber. And because the man is undefined, he's a bit easier to demonize. And although I guess demonizing, suggesting tarring him with something that's not accurate. In this case, you just need to sort of point out the actual things he said.
And he was a lawyer for the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a group that believes in sterilizing transgender people abroad.
Yeah, I haven't. I can't say I followed that particular group very closely, but yes, he is. That was what his reputation was, and working with Tony Perkins from the Family Research Council as sort of a guest radio host for him.
There's an editorial that ran in the Shreveport, Louisiana paper where he wrote that he called homosexuality is inherently unnatural. I think you said that dangerous lifestyle that would lead to legalized pedophilia.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely sounds like something from another time, but it's back. And I mean, the very fact, as we were discussing a moment ago, that Tom Emmer couldn't be the Speaker of the House because he thought that gay marriage can be legal. I mean, this is the other side of that same coin.
As we talk today, there's been another mass shooting, and I wanted to ask you, your wife's a pollster, right?
That's right.
And her father is
also, yes,
also a pollster. And I just want to ask you about guns. And this is another place where it seems like the American people's views on this stuff are not. I mean, nothing's going to happen because of this one. Something happened after Uvalde because there were little children involved, but nothing's going to happen here. What does polling say about Americans' attitudes towards guns?
I think it's the same old story that if you look at where the opinion is, of course, Americans have had it with the constant violence and mass shootings and want common sense, gun control, background checks, whatnot. But it's always been a question about the intensity. The intensity of the pro-gun movement has been a lot stronger. And for that reason, Democrats have shied away from the issue. I think that has changed. Democrats are needlessly timid on this issue. Same way they're sort of needlessly timid on crime, for example. They could be out there quite a bit more on this, but that's not where they are right now. And I agree, nothing's going to happen in terms of legislation in this Congress. Or likely for some time to come. It just seems that our political system is going to accept this routine level of carnage. And yes, the one up in Maine was particularly ugly, but this is happening every day in America.
Where are Americans on just AR-15s? That'll never happen. How many Americans have AR-15s? How many guns are there out there? It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, the extremes of it. This happened a bit with the braces for guns, basically turning your common handgun into more of a long barrel assault weapon. That fight earlier this year in Congress, you had the House rising up against very common sense regulations coming from the Biden administration. So if anything, things are going in the other direction. And how many people are using shoulder braces to to turn their handguns into deadlier weapons? There were very, very few Americans are actually doing that.
So let's look at Trump's hold on the party. That seems total now, right?
It seemed total before. There was a brief moment, I guess, before they rallied around him again because of his legal troubles. When he first rolled out his 2024 campaign, it looked like he had been done and DeSantis was on the rise. But that is long gone. So he is certainly as in command, if not more so than he's always been. I mean, you see it in the polls, obviously, where he's 40, 50 points ahead of his nearest competitor for the Republican nomination. That contest is essentially over. But you also see it in the way that the House Speaker election went. Chuck Fleischmann, one of the unknown candidates, Trump actually released on his Truth Social a series of texts from Fleischmann. They were the most sycophantic things, saying, please tell them they're voting now. We're all for Trump. All of the remaining candidates are for Trump. We love him. And even Trump, who can, never get enough of the sycophants, actually apparently thought this one was too much because he actually posted it online to humiliate Fleischmann.
I had thought after the first indictment in New York and Trump's support went up, I said, well, okay, but what's going to happen when there are more indictments? And now there have been more indictments and his support has solidified.
Right. And 3 guilty pleas down in Georgia and it still solidifies.
Yeah. And so I'm looking at those, and every time you see someone pleading guilty and they're going to testify presumably against him. And I just started thinking very recently, oh, maybe that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter that he may be convicted. Say he gets convicted in the January 6th trial.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It doesn't matter to the Republican presidential primary voters. I mean, that's where we look at his 90% support or whatever it is. But I still believe that 70% of this country is sane. 70% of the country is looking at Donald Trump. Having an outburst in the courtroom, defying gag orders, storming out of the court, looking at the guilty pleas, looking at the, 22 chaotic days without a speaker in the House and saying, hey, I don't really want to have this, running the country again. So it solidifies his base support, but Donald Trump is doing nothing to expand that base of support. The very few persuadable voters in the middle are not going to be happy with this kind of chaos. And it's not necessarily captured in the polls, but it's going to be a question of a year from now, who is actually going to go out and vote? And are people going to say, yeah, I'm really fired up. I just, I'm really excited about, all the guilty pleas and all the chaos. And that's really going to drive me to, pull the lever for the Republicans.
I think there are people going to be fired up about the guilty plea. I mean, this is the information universe that we live in. It's the Bannon, flooding the zone with shit, right?
Yeah. But I agree. There are people fired up, but I think those are in the 30% who are, not operating on team normal, as they say.
Except, where do the polls? Again, your wife's family.
Yes, I get it through osmosis, but no, I don't. I don't claim to be a polling expert.
Right.
But the polls are showing, the horse race polls looking at the election a year out. They're useless, but they show, a very tight election. Most show Biden slightly leading. Some, like the Washington Post poll, show Trump leading. But again, those don't capture what turnout is going to be. And that's the real question of who's depressed and who's not depressed. There are a lot of people who are not in that MAGA 30% of America who are saying, I don't want the chaos.
Well, this is why the third party vote in 16 was the difference, I would suggest. And I think data shows that. I think you're right. There's a certain percentage of Americans that will vote for Donald Trump and a certain percentage that won't. But the percentage that will is 46% or something like that, and 47%. And do you see any traction from a Robert Kennedy Jr. or Cornel West?
I mean, it's hard to see from him just because I think people are aware of just how loony he is. So it's hard to see the traction there. But then you've got no labels, which is Mark Penn, the former Democratic pollster, sort of turned against the Democratic Party, which is essentially, I don't know what their intention is to reform American government, but the practical effect of what they're doing right now is to go to key battleground states and effectively hand the election to Donald Trump. So will it work? I don't think so, but it's certainly a threat that democracy does not need at this particular moment.
And that's Joe Lieberman too, right?
Yep, yeah, that's Joe Lieberman's crowd. So I think people will be wise to this and see what that's about. It's a fair argument to say that we do need this would be a good time for a shakeup in our politics. Third parties never succeed, but they push us in a different direction.
Oh, don't say that. Don't say it. Don't say that. Why did you say that?
This particular effort is a very cynical one.
And it's being funded, right? By,
of course, it's
right-wing money,
the MAGA folks, because they're funding RFK Jr. for that matter. So this isn't sometimes it's good for a third party to shake things up. This isn't a third party effort. This is a cynical barnacle on the Trump campaign.
So what is the business before the Congress? First of all, to keep the government going, right?
Yeah, November 17th is the next deadline. So they've got to figure out something about that. I probably even before that figure out whether there'll be supplemental funding for Israel, which seems likely, for Ukraine, which is likely but more in doubt.
Now Johnson is not for funding Ukraine.
He has voted against it, and the Gateses of the world are saying most in the this is not clear, but the Gateses of the world are saying most in the Republican caucus do not support funding for Ukraine. Therefore, he cannot bring that bill to the floor. So, and if he's going to do that in a couple of weeks, that'll be the first test. Will the fractured Republican caucus, divide again and enter into a new round of chaos over that? The other thing he's got to decide is there's a privilege resolution from some of the New York Republicans trying to expel George Santos. Does he bring that up? The House would surely vote to expel Santos, but then the 4-seat majority for Republicans becomes a 3-seat majority. What is Mike Johnson going to do there? So that, those are sort of the issues he's got to deal with just over the next 3 weeks.
Okay. Well, thanks for bringing us up to date, and let's hope that the Republican caucus cuts him enough slack to keep the government going. Well, thanks.
Well, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, even if the events in our country are not pleasurable.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening. That beautiful music is by Leo Kottke, the great Leo Kottke. I want to thank Peter Ogburn for producing this podcast. We'll talk again next week.